take that disco music as my chance to get started. AV team, we're good to go? Fantastic. All right, so as if you didn't have enough of me from the opening panel, here I am again for the last time until Cyber Meetup. I'm going to jump right into this topic. We have about 35 to 40 minutes, and I want to stay true to time as much as possible. Before I begin, we gave this panel, or this session, a really fancy Nancy name. Tea poisoning and something something. See, that's how much I remember it. But tea poisoning. Anybody in this room know what tea poisoning is about? Or what does it reference? Go ahead.
Tea was the Microsoft assistant that got poisoned because it was set up to actually interact with its users and learn from those interactions, and humans suck. They learned really bad things really quickly and intelligently decided to process those in very interesting ways.
Fantastic. Well said. If you are in my class, guaranteed A+. Your name, kind sir?
My name is Jonathan Sanders.
And you're with?
I'm with Asterisk Security. I'm a vendor. Beware.
Beware. Good to have you here, Jonathan. It's a pleasure. But thank you for summarizing that really, really well for us. To put it very simply, a lot of times when we teach AI, when we talk about AI with our teams, we tend to say it's, security and AI, it's like that seatbelt. You don't really know what it's worth until you actually crash and hit that moment when you see its value. Over the last 2 years, the number of attacks from a generative AI perspective have increased. And the tough thing about all of this is you actually don't even know something has happened until a very, very long time later. Yes, for a very long period of time in security, we've talked about attackers laying dormant in our environments and then us realizing their footprints sometime later. But in the case of generative AI, it can go on for a very long time, and you don't know that exfiltration has actually taken place. We use tea poisoning as that metaphor to kind of show you that this new generation of attacks doesn't necessarily depend on someone clicking on something. It can come in the form of zero-click worms as well. So over the next 35 to 40 minutes, what we'll be doing is in 3 levels. We'll be looking at, from a strategic and a management perspective, what are those questions you want to be asking about your generative AI systems and how you're using them. We'll then look at the software development lifecycle as well and understand what are those questions you need to be asking, what are those analysis points and those frameworks, as Chris Roberts said. And then we'll look at it from an identity and an Active Directory standpoint, and then a use case within operational technology on how generative AI is shaping things from a security perspective from an OT standpoint. With that, I'm going to ask these panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start all the way from here, randomly, to keep you on your toes. Can you introduce yourself, but also tell us, what about generative AI has got your team quite busy?
Thanks. My name is Lita Willett. I'm the general manager of the cybersecurity practice at TELUS. I've been with TELUS for many, many years, but in the cyber realm for about 10 years. What I'm most interested in, or what excites me about AI, is its accessibility. So machine learning has been part of cyber technology for many, many years, but only a select few really ever touched it, were involved in it. Certainly I never was. But AI and the large language models have brought AI to everyday users, your children, your parents. Everybody can use an AI application. So we're seeing a ton of accessibility. We're seeing that in our organizations, which is great, but also increases our risk. So we've got that balance. But I'm really excited about the accessibility.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing more on the TELUS perspective on generative AI and what questions you need to be asking from an executive standpoint. With that said, I'll go next to my friend from St. Paris.
He was looking at me the whole time.
I made it too obvious. I tried. I'll get better.
I'm James Ravenel. I'm a senior solutions architect at St. Paris. We're an AD security company. I've been there for about 7 months now. Been in IT for 30-something years, so I've always been tangentially aligned with security. Before being there, I was at Barclays, where I was an AD engineer, and that really gave me a different insight on just how much data we consume. I think I think we were consuming about 1.5 terabytes almost a day in just logs. So when you have that, like like she said, it's really so much that you may not be aware of that's happening in your environment, despite your best efforts. So I love the accessibility of generative AI, especially. But there are some concerns. I'm a 50-year-old black guy from Brooklyn, and I was just talking to AI last night, having a conversation, and it was cool that, if my grandfather was alive, I'd tell him I was talking to Data from Star Trek. Anybody know who that is? Okay. But it's also very scary about how much we don't know, the things that we need to do to now protect data and also identity, especially. So looking forward to expanding on that later.
I think the topic of machine identities and how that's shifted, especially with the generative AI piece, is going to be something we'll dive a lot deeper into. And I will, although we won't define it, we'll sort of have you see if you can tease that out. There's a very big difference between what we can now call traditional AI and generative AI. Mm-hmm. And understanding that difference is going to be something that I just don't want to theoretically put to you, but practically bring out through this discussion. Next, I'm going to go to my friend from Black Duck.
That's right. So I'm David Bennis from Black Duck Software. We have a lot of tools in every acronym that you can imagine for the most part. IAST, DAST, SAST, and also services in terms of security assurance. And so on that services side of the house, I lead the emerging technology domain. So I've dealt with a lot of greenfield technologies over the years, primarily from an offensive security perspective, but more and more over the past 4 or 5 years towards how do we build our programs to actually speak to how this increases our risk overall within the organization. And what excites me about generative AI is, like everyone on this panel has said so far, the accessibility aspect is amazing. Interacting with ChatGPT and Google Gemini, it really changes the paradigm of how we interact with the internet and therefore how we interact with each other, which is really, really cool and also really scary, of course. From a professional perspective, I think I'm excited because from an offensive security, from a defensive security perspective, there's so much that can be done with generative AI that aids us in our everyday use of traditional security tooling. And also, it'll just be fun to break at organizations. And it has been fun over the past year to do exactly that.
It'll be fun to break until it breaks your technologies as well. So we'll dive into that as we are trying to use less generative AI solutions to pan out the sun from this exotic location that we find ourselves in.
Wow.
They'll figure it out somehow. With that, I'm going to go to, it's a pleasure to share the stage with you because 5 years ago, I shared the classroom with you when you were my student, and I told you one day I'll be working for you. That day is coming very, very soon.
Yeah.
Samuel, please tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know why I have this chair like this. If you don't mind, can I change it so that I can face this part of the audience?
I think I'll do the same.
Okay, thank you. It's like they don't want me to talk to you, but I'll figure it out. Yeah, my name is Samuel Aluko, like I rightly said, and I'm currently the cybersecurity lead at Sterling Crane. Sterling Crane is actually a business unit of Mammon Crane Services, and we have over 650 crane fleets across North America. We are one of the largest crane services across North America. So the interesting thing about my current journey is I've actually worked with an organization before that I've been working with traditional security that we all know, dictating, trying to undo incidents and what have you, right? But right now, interesting part is I'm dealing more with security in operational technology, where we have IoTs, where we have predictive devices connected to the crane services, and you also have to look at the security part of that as well. So this is where it's become interesting to me. And like everybody said about the generative AI, it's interesting to see how it's accessible. It's interesting to see what it can actually do with this new generation. But the most important thing for me right now is, we know it's actually work with our predictive of, in terms of the security, traditional security that we have. But right now, the interest towards how do we ensure that the security of the generative AI itself, when we use that with operational technology like the IoT devices, so that's kind of more interesting to me, and that is where my focus area is right now.
That parallels with Industry 4.0, and it's something we will dive very deeply into this. Now, before I go into my questions, I'll put two things out there. Firstly, that definition and the difference between generative AI and what we can loosely call traditional AI. But secondly, if you haven't yet, or rather let me rephrase that, anybody here know about the MITRE Atlas framework? You've been paying attention in class, even though that was 5 years ago. Anybody else? Maybe one or two folks. Highly, highly recommend. Noor, if I can ask you, why do you think that framework is so important, very quickly, the MITRE Atlas framework?
I'm not too familiar with the details, but it is helpful for us like emerging technologies
Yep.
so I think that's fair.
Yeah, glad to see that you're using that at CIBC, but I'll also add this, that the case studies that are available there, where they break down the TTPs in exact detail, the reconnaissance behind it, how it actually goes through. There's a lot to take in there, but it's a very, very good way to begin to understand the weaponization of generative AI in different ways. So with that said, I'll come to you first.
Sure.
There's your traditional IT risk, and then there's the generative AI risk. Can you help us understand what's that difference between the two, and what do you get leaders to think about as they're adopting some of these LLMs, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I think we're all pretty versed in IT risk and the types of things we need to worry about. What's really different with generative AI is it's continuous learning, right? It's taking data and it's continuously changing. So its outputs are continuously changing versus traditional IT, which, relatively static, if we can say that. So when we're thinking about, how do we do things differently, one of the things that's really important, and one of the things we've focused on at TELUS, is that the best ideas from AI are going to come, our best use cases for AI in your organization are probably going to come from your team, like your team members. It's not going to come from on high from an executive. So we need people to be able to use it, to try it, to test it, and to build their, co-pilots or whatever you want to call them to be able to do work. But how do we do that really, really safely? In a traditional IT environment, you could do that pretty easily. It's a little harder with generative AI. So what we've done is try to take that balanced approach to making sure all users can access it, are encouraged to try it, to come up with ideas, because we need that innovation, whether it's to serve customers, whether it's to reduce mundane work that's disengaging for our team, whether it's to become more efficient. We need that. But it's really about balancing that risk. So putting in guidelines, really, really focusing on people, process, and technology, much more so than we would in even traditional IT, but like doubling down on that culture of security, security by design, privacy, like making sure those foundations, which are really critical in traditional IT and traditional IT security, when those foundations are there, that allows you to make that leap into generative AI.
Okay. I'll work with that, and that's a perfect segue to just sort of also introduce those differences, traditional IT, traditional AI, and generative. If I had to put it into one simple sentence, when we talk about traditional AI, it's learning from data and making predictions.
Yeah.
You look at generative AI, it's generating new types of data.
Yeah.
That could be used for multiple purposes. I'll bring you into the conversation, and I'll just rephrase the question a little bit based on what we heard this morning from Chris Roberts. Within generative AI systems, most practitioners here would tell you, you need to have some sort of validation, some sort of human in the loop to look at what your outputs are. What are some best practices now from a Gen AI standpoint and a software dev standpoint that you would recommend looking at it to secure what the human in the loop function like is?
Absolutely. I think a lot of that element is going to be policy and governance driven within organizations. No one is going to define what bias means for you. No one's going to define what safety means for you in your organization. It's often this massive conversation that needs to happen across multiple stakeholders. Legal, HR probably is involved in that. And in the traditional technology world, that doesn't really happen oftentimes. These discussions that need to happen across the technical group and the non-technical group, especially as it relates to legal and HR. So That, to me, we've seen this marked paradigm shift within organizations of how to deal with that risk and how to measure that risk. Is they have to first answer the question of, what are we measuring that risk against?
Fair enough. Working with that, then, and I'll come on to the identity piece very shortly, but Samuel, you've been talking a lot about using generative AI systems for your OT services. For example, let's say sensors and detections for one of the crane operators that you may have, using computer vision technologies, whatever it may be. But you've expressed a lot of concern from a security standpoint, specifically around how those outputs going to these mechanical objects could be, for lack of a better word, altered.
Yep.
How do you go about testing the safety of a Gen AI system before you put it into production?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think I would kind of take it back to, like I said earlier, we have the traditional, security where we have AI helping us with detection, with incident response, but we are not paying close attention to how the security of AI itself in terms of the development life cycle and how we introduce, security by design into that. And the reason is because most organizations are always so excited to adopt the end product rather than considering the security part of it. And in the process, they just want to see the functionality of that, AI or the IoT device, but not considering the security. And the security actually could cost us a huge, cost in terms of what regards to operational technology, especially in crane services. It's a different ball game, when we are talking about the traditional IT. But in operational technology, the risk is actually very huge. Take, for example, we were talking about the data poisoning, which is the tail poisoning that we're talking about. Let's say we have a crane services that has a plugin to an IoT device or an IC that is tracking the speed, of a crane within maybe a construction site, and the speed is meant to be between, let's say, 40. And if there's a compromise, if there's an attack, if the data is not properly, if the development of that is not properly done, and an attacker or an adversary can actually poison that data, it can lead to giving a bias, result where we start seeing crane running at, 100 kilometers per second in the construction site. So that's where this becomes so critical, and that's why we place attention to that. So for us, in an OT environment, we want to ensure that we do the proper risk assessment before the adoption of that IoT devices. And that's where this becomes so critical, not so too excited about the end result. We know this is what we want to achieve, but we also put security in place and by design while we try to adopt, those generative AI or AI devices.
I'll work with that and bring in the identity piece. Because now there's two pieces to this. One is obviously verifying and authenticating users into your environment. But now also there's this other challenge. If you look at something like the Morris Tuver, where the AI basically, which was an LLM, essentially starts going down this hallucination path, gets poisoned in different ways, starts hallucinating, and can often happen because of an insider. Insider asking certain questions, using certain syntax, and ultimately, through their login, able to get the model to learn something different or do something adversarial. My question to you is, how has generative AI systems shaped or reshaped the way in which Simperis, for example, looks at identity?
So it's I think there's a lot of paths to answer this question. When we were talking about this, I started really looking to see what Gen AI security implementations are out there, right? From a defense standpoint, and I don't see a lot of that. We do see, like what we do here at Simperis is we're using ML to help understand what's happening in our identity, in I should say not our, but in your identity systems, right? We would be learning from your data. And so it's more of using AI as a defense mechanism. I don't think that we have enough preparation for Gen AI to go out and be proactive about what could be coming at us? It's kind of a hard question to answer because there really isn't enough in production right now. I don't really know of any Gen AI production that's doing what is necessary. But I think what folks should be paying attention to is, what do you consider protecting your identity? Because like you were saying, you have all of these systems, but what if someone does get in and compromise your system? Now they have access to your data. We say often that threat actors, they don't break in, they just log on now, right? And these generative AI systems that are designed to attack your identity, for instance, they're getting more and more sophisticated. So we do constantly look for ways to improve the way that we are defending against it, and also bringing awareness about what's happening in your identity. What is your, do you have more than just a snapshot of your security posture? Do you know what new accounts have been generated in your environment? We talked to, I forget who mentioned it, the dwell time that a threat actor can be inside of your environment. It could be a day. It could be 200 days. You really don't know if you're not taking the necessary steps to see what's happening in your environment and then act on it. Yeah. I think apathy plays a huge role in why people get compromised.
And I'll take that a step further from a role-based access perspective. Mm-hmm. One of the things, and I see some colleagues from the university sector and college sector here, one of the things that you see, at least in Ontario, and I'm going to argue probably throughout Canada now, is a lot of developments around generative AI. You tend to see 3 levels of teams perform. One's your internal. Then, at least in Ontario, which is the context I'm familiar with, and we worked on these projects together, you see a lot of funding coming in from OCI, NSERC, and SHRC, but you end up hiring postdocs, graduate students, but these provide your second level of research, but now they have access into your environments. Mm-hmm. And then there is an increasing amount of, well, it's always been the case, increasing amount of outsourcing to do a lot of your development work. Yep. This changes a lot of where your data is going and data is moving to.
Yes.
And it does present, especially with how data is being worked with, presents a whole different set of challenges around how you manage identities, and eventually the case of dormant accounts and whatever else have you. That said, I'll come back to you. And this is a question that we get quite a lot. You hear this term a lot, DevSecOps, right? With generative AI systems and how it works with data, how do you see that changing now? The traditional, what we call DevSecOps, and how it's now changing with how we do generative AI development. What's your perspective there?
Yeah, I think everyone here has probably heard the concept of MLSecOps within organizations. What that means is entirely different depending on which client I talk to. And ultimately, a lot of that is because what I mentioned before, when it comes to the definitions of what you're concerned about, it varies based off of who you're talking to. But in terms of having a really, really good program that is capable of mitigating risk within your development pipeline, a lot of that comes back to what everyone here was talking about, the data security aspect. Understanding how your attack surface has grown because of the generative artificial intelligence implementations, but especially the data aspect. Because we're used to securing data in various silos throughout the organization with access in AD, federated very, very specifically. In a post-Gen AI world, a lot of that data is no longer just siloed. You're putting it all into one big pot a lot of times in order to have a co-pilot generative AI of some kind within your organization that's useful. And so understanding how that changes your threat surface is really hugely important for making sure that DevSecOps pipeline mitigates risk.
In terms of mitigating risk, I'll come back to the TELUS question. One of the things we like to do is, if we're taking on a new tool, we have a vendor risk scorecard that we run them through. We ask a couple of questions and then we rate. Some will do this using some automated tools, some will do it more manual. If budget's never a thing, people figure out different ways to do it. But generative AI coming into this, how does it change how you rate an organization and the risk you take on by taking on their software, for example? How do you educate leaders now in quantifying some of the risk and really making those decisions based on some quantitative metrics?
I think I may actually go at this a little bit differently because I'm not involved in the vendor selection, like the testing side of it. But when we look more generally at risk-based, like making a decision on risk and generative AI, we look at whether, if we're building something in AI, if it's going to be externally facing, if it's for a critical function, if it's going to be for a customer, that risk goes way up, and the amount of testing and the things we do are going to be much higher than if it's an internal use. Also, what data is being used. If it's got customer information or personal information of our team, et cetera, that's going to really change the risk profile and the amount of testing. And so if we extend that to like the vendor context, same thing. If we're bringing in a vendor and they're going to be touching our data, touching our customers' data, our employees, providing a critical function that's external facing, then that rating is going to, risk is much higher, and the amount of diligence that we're going to spend and the amount of planning, we'll build an entire data enablement plan around that, make sure it matches our governance. We'll go, much, much deeper than if it's something that's just going to be used internally and won't have access to data that's critical, which unfortunately is very rare because almost everything touches some piece of data that's critical in some way, shape, or form. But we go quite deep into a full data enablement plan that says what is the data and what system is it going to touch all the way through its life cycle. It's tedious. Yeah. It can be painful for every single project and every new vendor, but it really is part of like the overall data and trust policy that we try and push forward.
This is something that Bill spoke about in the opening panel, and this was the idea of data mapping and showing proof of value. So Samuel, I'll come to you, and then we'll go back to an identity question as well. And again, we have about 6 minutes left, so if anybody has any pressing questions, throw them away. Samuel, testing. You've got all of these different vendors coming at you. You have internal developments around generative AI. What are some guardrails that you are setting in place? Is it mapped to a particular framework? How are you testing before pushing any of this code into production? And I know that this may not necessarily traditionally be a security function, might just be under the DevOps team, but your oversight in this is starting to grow for a reason. Tell us a little bit more about what those sandboxes look like.
Yeah, I think, for us, testing is kind of critical, and it's important. And why it's important, like I usually say, is that the results of, if there's an issue, if anything goes wrong with OT security, the advanced effect of that is different from the traditional security because it's going to affect the safety. Someone's life is going to be lost. Like you can imagine crane lifting some heavy weights and just being compromised, and it's just drop that on someone. So we usually want to take testing and ensure that those devices, robots that we want to use, the IoT that we are plugging into our operational devices or tools, it's well tested properly. And the testing is not just testing after we got the device. We want to ensure that we introduce the concept of testing into the development aspect as well. And not just that, we want to ensure that we are also part of the process. Being part of the process is important. We just don't want to give us the end product. And we also inherit the vulnerabilities, we inherit the risk, and we are now testing that maybe on production environment. That's when we identify that there's an issue with this, then we go back. So what we want to try and introduce now based on the policy, there are several policies out there, the ISO 4200 that helps with the development and implementation of ML and generative AI. There's NIST AMF policy that actually talks about how you can test, how you can be able to ML as SecDevOps. So testing is also part of that process. And like I said, we want to ensure that we have our team. We want to be part of that. Even after that has been fully developed and we are ready to go live, we still want to test that to ensure that we are not inheriting any risk that could actually jeopardize the safety of the entire organization. Because the risk, the end result is kind of going to be huge. A life is going to be lost, and we don't want that to happen.
I'll just work with that a little bit. We've got about 4 minutes left, and we had a question around monitoring and how identity can be weaved into the continuous monitoring of how generative AI systems are working with your data. Can you shed a little bit of light around how identity ties into that process as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's wise to only do a snapshot of what's happening in your environment. You need to be continuously looking at indicators of exposure, indicators of compromise, indicators of attack. Are you being attacked right now? And if you are you aware of that? Right? And with these smarter tools that are being generated to compromise you, you want to make sure that you're doing more than just getting a static report of something. It's helpful to know. I was talking to Alfio earlier. He uses one of our tools, Purple Knight. It's great. It gives you a snapshot of what's happening in your environment. But as I said to him, some of our other products, what they're intending to do is to continually look at what is happening in your environment. And I think a lot of most of the people that I speak to on a daily basis are CISOs, they're security architects, sometimes infrastructure teams, and they're not always aware of how important it is to constantly be looking at specifically their identity and how that can change. We talked about generative AI. Imagine in the course of a day, you're just doing your work and 1,000 accounts got created and you have no awareness to it. Yep. That's problematic, right? So you want to have tools that are inside of your environment that can look for those anomalies and say, hey, something's not right here. At a minimum, let me bubble this up to you. You should be able to see that and say, hey, this is good. You know, our team is really working today. They're doing that backlog of tickets. Or, hey, this is bad. Everybody that's in there looks like a format that we don't use. So continually looking at your environment is going to be critical to you.
I'll take that. And there was a question that I had, which I wasn't able to bring on stage, but I think it suits well to the perspective you bring to the table, and we'll come to a soft landing with this, is that from a generative AI perspective and security perspective, are there any particular sectors where you're seeing Gen AI being adopted that get you a little nervous from a security standpoint?
I'm not sure there's a particular sector where I'm worried, I'm nervous. I think what we're going to find is the more generative AI is the bigger attack surface. So organizations that maybe have weak culture of security aren't really focused on their data and the kind of the trust around that, aren't really, I mean, let's face it, so many of the incidents that I see in our customers are not, novel, huge, interesting, big new threats. They're like, they didn't patch something, or they deployed endpoint and only put it on, missed 20% of their endpoints and thought they were well protected. Like it's back to the basics sometimes. So those organizations that are struggling for lots of good reasons, struggling to keep up with their cyber posture, AI and generative AI is just going to make that exposure so much bigger. So I don't worry about a particular sector. I worry about those companies or those organizations, whether they be governments or private sector or whatever, that are struggling to keep up, are only going to fall further behind with generative AI and more exposed. And that for us as a society is troubling when you think about our data, as if you're a citizen of a municipality and they're struggling to keep up, or an organization or a healthcare organization, or anybody that you give your data to, generative AI is going to make that harder for them. So that's where I worry, and that's what would keep me up at night.
10 seconds.
Sure.
For me, the sectors that I see and hear the most threats are government and healthcare.
Yeah.
Right, like
they're targets.
They're such targets because they have so much rich data that can really harm.
Yeah.
Can I chime in?
Of course.
Yeah, 5 seconds.
You're not in class anymore. You don't need
I know. Like I said, my focus is shifted to operational technology, and they are talking about traditional security right now. That's what it is. But when I was doing my research, I was nervous about even my own sector, because during my research, I see that there's a push that's coming up for autonomous cranes. So where crane is going to be automated, nobody is driving that. We just have cranes do this, leave this, based on the data that has been, trained, and data set that has been projected, and you can actually decide on what to do. And I was like,
that's terrifying.
So to be honest, I ran to one of the branch manager this week. I'm like, sorry, do we have autonomous crane in our company, and it was like, yeah, there's an innovation that's going on that, though we don't have that yet. I'm like, thank God we don't have that. But yeah, when I was reading about it, there's so much security concern about that. And something we didn't mention today that I want us to I don't like talking about it, but let's just leave it that way. It's the data retention and the, what's that word I'm looking for again? Data protection, data retention, and
Transfer?
the data transfer of your generative AI. For us, how do I know where my data is being, stored? How do I know what is happening to my training data? It's more like an asset to us. It's a proprietary data. So that's more of the concern, and it's going to be an huge concern by the time we start shifting to that autonomous, crane services. So it's a big fear to me, but I think it's an high hope now to start doing research and to start learning and how to kind of be able to mitigate that.
And since we're on the topic, closing word to you, a sector that really concerns you around generative AI security.
Yeah, I think I'm going to cop out and say all of them, but I'll underscore it. I'll underscore it with everything that everyone has been saying so far. Is ultimately, there's people involved in all of these sectors, no matter the technology, no matter the sector. And there's a very famous Georgia Tech study where essentially people were following a robot during an evacuation, and even when it would go opposite of the clearly posted evacuation signs, it followed the robot anyway. They followed the robot anyway, which is terrifying to think about. And so even when we say things like have a human in the loop, we have to make sure that the human that is in the loop is well versed with what can go wrong and the limitations of the thing.
Well put. Well said. So with that said, we have come to the end of our time, but I will jump in very quickly and say this, is that there are two things that I've taken away. Number one is that intersection now between Gen AI development and the cybersecurity team, seeing them as two separate entities, that's blurring very, very quickly. And it's going to be interesting to see how things move here in Ontario and in Canada as a whole. But for me, what's really concerning is when you look at how easy it is today using, DeepSeek, using whatever you want, to write some form of polymorphic malware, to write some sort of an inject, and then for shits and giggles, deploy it. I'll remind everyone that the first known cyber attack, which goes back to the Morris worm in the 1980s, was essentially deployed for shits and giggles by a student out of Carnegie Mellon University. And that spread. I think that ability now to just willy-nilly launch and develop and generate attacks will change our world quite a bit. As I said in the opening session, that yesterday's concerns and worries are today's threats. If you're not one step ahead, you will be left behind. And I really hope that you found this session to be useful. I want to thank my panelists. I invite you to visit their booths. I invite you to speak to them as well. Thank you all for attending, and I will see you throughout the rest of the conference. Appreciate it.